people who come into the waiting room, that would be great. Alrighty. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you all for joining us this evening or afternoon. To those of you joining us for the first time, we're part of the International Muslim Society in America, IMSA, and this is a program presented by our youth department. This is actually IMSA Youth's first event after our Ramadan program. So as always, we're very thankful to those of you who have come to take the time to learn with us. This event is currently live on Facebook and YouTube. So assalamu alaikum and hello to everyone joining us through there as well. And as always, thank you to Radio IMSA and IMSA's operations department for helping us broadcast this smoothly. And thank you for the IMSA youth team for always giving us something to do and something to be excited about. My name is Zahra Hanifa and I'm IMSA's youth director, but today I have the great honor of being the moderator and the host for this session. Before we begin and before I introduce our panelists to you all, I just wanted to provide some context for this event. So I think we're all at the very least aware of the injustices and ongoing struggles currently happening in Palestine. We know that this has been and still is a constant struggle, an increasing crisis for decades on end. You and I know this, our families and closest circles most likely also know this. But I think something that a lot of us might struggle with is how do we best explain this to others outside of our closest circles? Especially when the media narrative is so straight cut and cutthroat and seems to argue against everything we know and believe. And secondly, how can we best help? Because sometimes just sharing posts through social media just doesn't feel like it's enough, or it just doesn't feel like it's doing much at all. So as IMSA youth, something we constantly try to uphold is we want to raise the voices and stories where it matters most. This isn't a direct part of our POV series, a series where we hear from the often untold stories of Muslims in America, but we do still want to hear directly from those impacted the most. So today we have with us 3 Palestinian women, all of whom have experience in community organizing or activism, which we can learn a great deal from. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And just a note, if you have questions you'd like to ask them, please feel free to put them in the chat or private message me. And then also to our panelists, before we get started, just a note, please feel free to bounce off from each other and speak whenever you feel is like necessary or appropriate. You don't have to like wait for a prompt from the moderator, basically. So first, to introduce our panelists, we have Hannah. Hannah Shraim is a Palestinian American activist and freedom fighter. She leads the Muslim Prison Project with CARE Maryland, or the Council on American Islamic Relations Maryland chapter, and has extensive experience seeking justice alongside marginalized communities. Next, we have Lena. Lena Ismail is a Palestinian American, a graduate from the University of Washington, and currently has her doctorates in nurse practitioner. She was the vice president of the United Muslim Relief at UW Seattle. While she's no longer active in the club, she continues to help with organizing protests and events. Additionally, she advocates for Palestinian liberation, along with the liberation of any oppressed groups of people. And finally, we have a friend of mine who I actually met through doing activism work, so it feels very full circle to be able to introduce you all to Malak. Malak is a rising senior at U of I, majoring in community health and minoring in Arabic studies while on the pre-med track. She was a multicultural advocate for university housing this past year, and this role assumes an active role in the advancement and multiculturalism and social justice within the residence halls through community and staff development, education, celebration, and dialogue. She's the Equity and Inclusion Chair of Phi Delta Epsilon and also the President of UMMA, the Underrepresented Muslim and Minority Advocates at U of I. She will also be working closely with SJP, or the Students for Justice in Palestine next year, as Palestinian liberation is one thing Malak is very passionate about. So before we go into our prepared questions on our subject, I noticed that the three of you are each really like impressive and involved in your own communities. I wanted to first ask, firstly, if there's anything you'd like to share about yourselves that the bios may not have covered, and also ask what motivates you to constantly advocate for not only Palestinians, but also all marginalized people and communities. So anyone can take the floor to begin.
I can start us off, inshallah. Thank you, everyone, for joining our panel today. I'm really honored to be speaking with these two amazing Palestinian women. Outside of my community activism, I work with alongside defense attorneys with public defenders. And so I have experience working in the criminal legal system as well. And so the reason why I'm consistently fighting for communities, I mean, it's intrinsically connected to my identity as a Palestinian, but also as a Muslim. Like, as a Muslim, we're commanded by God to demand justice, even if it's against ourselves. So it's very much natural for me to take up different justice causes because I feel like that's what our faith calls us to do. But particularly as a Palestinian, like growing up, you grow up understanding what it means to have your existence denied. You grow up understanding what it means to be cautious of who you tell that you're Palestinian. So it's kind of a part of our upbringing, particularly in the United States. And so particularly in my work with public defenders and understanding the intricacies of the criminal legal system, I see how different struggles against injustice are interconnected. And so I feel like that's also what pushes me to keep fighting, because I'm like, just because this, certain people might be free, like if one of us is experiencing injustice, if one group of people is experiencing injustice, then all of us are going to feel the effects of that injustice. And I think one really poignant example of this is the fact that US police officers are trained by Israeli Defense Forces. Like, that's a really stark connection, I would say, between what's happening in occupied Palestine and the system of oppression that's propagated against Palestinians and how it is applied in the United States against Black people and people of color. And so even though the situations are oceans apart, they're very much connected. And I feel like that's what pushes me to keep fighting, because I'm like, none of us are free if some of us are experiencing injustice. So I'll start off with that.
And yeah, honestly, my reasons are pretty similar. Just like Hannah said, from a young age, I remember going to protests from like the age of 8. And just from there, you just like you learn and you just continue to learn more and see how all our struggles are connected. And a book I would recommend is Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. And you can learn a lot about the interconnectedness of all of our struggles. But in addition to that, one thing that does keep me going is my religion. Islam does require us to resist all wrongdoings and evils. And there's like this one hadith by the Prophet, peace be upon him. Whoever witnesses something evil, let him change it with his hand. And if he's unable to change it with his hand, then with his tongue. And if he's unable to, then with his heart. But that is the weakest of faith. So Islam does not allow you to be a bystander. Social justice is pretty central to our religion. So that's something that does keep me going as well.
Yeah, I just want to say that, like what these two amazing accomplished Palestinian women have said, that I work as a nurse practitioner at a community health clinic, and most of our patients are immigrants, undocumented, refugees, and the reason why I do that is I really care about my religion. My sense of identity has always instilled a deep passion for community health, for my community. So that's, I see that as like a form of activism, taking care of my community, and an extension of working towards a Palestinian liberation. But it's all connected. Like injustice is all bred through colonialism and greed and just post-colonial violence. So sorry, it makes me shake just thinking about it. But it's very inspiring to see like so many people who like recognize that it's all interconnected, and the importance of working not only towards like a goal of like Palestinian liberation, but also helping your community. And it's like, both Hannah and Malak said, it's, from Islam and from being born Palestinian, and from a very, very young age, seeing how injustice impacts your daily life, seeing your parents cry whenever, like when they were denied residency in their own home, from seeing like my grandmother die in the United States, thousands of miles away, when she really wanted to die in Betiksa, which is in East Jerusalem. So that just like living that daily struggle is, I don't want anyone else to live that struggle, and that's why we're here.
Awesome, thank you. Those were all really great answers. Yeah, just a constant reminder that it's easy to say that all injustices are connected, but like living it and seeing it in your work and seeing it in the day-to-day lived experiences of everybody is always very, very telling. So thank you for that. And the reminders that Islam, in fact, like will always encourage us to fight for against the evils of the and for the oppressed people. Awesome. Okay, so our first question is in regards to explaining the history behind Palestine and the current settler colonialism to people who are not aware. So it's likely really hard to cover events that start from 1918 and also much earlier. But how would you suggest best explaining the historical context, especially to those who seem to just wave it off as something way too complex to explain, or call it like a two-sided issue, things of that sort? How would you best combat those types of questions?
Go ahead, Malak. I want to make sure I'm doing the right pronunciation.
He did it correct. He said it correctly. So I think it is very important that someone takes the time to learn the general history of Palestine and how the state of Israel was created in order for them to understand Palestine as a country that's not undergoing conflict, but rather occupation and settler colonialism and apartheid. So I can do like a quick little rundown, a little history rundown, but so for us to be on the same page. So in the early 20th century, Europe, anti-Semitism was vast, fueling the creation of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The Balfour Declaration was the document constructed by British officials promising the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. So then after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine became a mandate under British rule until the UN created the partition plan in 1947. And it was between 1947 and 1949 that like 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians were forcibly removed and made refugees by Zionist paramilitaries. And at this point, I'm going to introduce the definition of settler colonialism by this historian called Denver Ortiz. So he states that settler colonialism is not an event, but rather a structure of elimination that requires violence and is based on the policy of genocide and land theft. So this definition clearly and perfectly aligns with the events beginning in 1947 and ongoing as we speak right now. So other events such as the Six-Day War, the Oslo Accords, and the First and Second Intifada all go to show the failures of international law and the global community to recognize the occupation as something that is only violently and rapidly growing. So from the start, Palestinians have been killed, displaced, and subject to oppressive policies stripping them of their basic rights, basic human rights. So any person who states that this is a conflict, let alone a complex one, fails to understand the history of Palestine and shows us the gruesomeness of settler colonialism and apartheid. So in doing so, you would see that the urgency of Palestine, the urgency of the issues and occupation in Palestine, and just eradicate like any notion of a second side.
Yeah, I think that was a really good overview. I will add that generally speaking, just existing as a Palestinian, it can be exhausting, because I feel like you're constantly telling people, you're constantly in a state of education, because people are just particularly in the US, are just so ill-informed, and that's not a coincidence. It's by design, by strategic design. There are Zionist organizations whose sole purpose is to keep the American public ill-informed so that the Zionist project can continue. And so I'll just add a little bit onto that lovely structuring, because I really think it helps orient people. The Zionist movement calls for a Jewish state in very, very brief terms. But what the reality of what it has culminated into is a Jewish state at the expense of the Palestinian people. So when the Zionist movement, I would say, actually began way before the World War II and all those events, it was kind of a slow process. Like, these few individuals came together and they said, we need a Jewish state. And so once things happened with the Holocaust, there was a further drive for getting a Jewish homeland, because there were a lot of people who were fleeing, Jews who were fleeing from the Holocaust. They became refugees in all these different places. Palestine was, and I'll say this because I think people don't fully understand this, Palestine was never a country. It's never like a fully established country that has been recognized internationally. Like, when we talk about Palestine today, Palestine was never like Palestine is not a separate country that's feuding with Israel. Like, Palestine is the land that is internationally recognized as Israel, and it always has been. Historic Palestine is in the Bible, so Palestine has existed is longer than Israel has ever existed. But when I'm talking about recognizing it being a country, like, Palestine hasn't really been in our century terms, right? So it's always been that indigenous group of people living on that land. But just to orient people on what we're talking about, so indigenous Palestinians actually lived in harmony with Muslim, Christian, and Jewish groups all live together. There are Muslim and Christian Palestinians. My whole mother's side of the family are all Christian Palestinians. So a lot of people like to claim this is a religious conflict. This is not about religion. Tell that to my Christian Palestinian family. Tell that to my Christian Jiddo. Allah yarhamu, may God rest his soul, that this is a religious conflict. It's not. This is about settler colonialism and the theft of indigenous land. So once Israel, or actually once there was this call for the Jewish state, the British at the time had control over Palestine after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so they were approached by the Zionists, and the Zionists were like, yo, I want this to now be Israel, and I want it to be a Jewish dominated state. And so the British in through the Balfour Declaration handed over the land. And so it wasn't theirs to give, right? And Palestine has always been for indigenous Palestinians. It wasn't theirs to give, but at the time they had control over the borders of Palestine. So they handed it over. Then 1948 signals the creation of Israel and what we call the Nakba. The Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. Palestinians today will tell you that the Nakba never ended for us. We are still experiencing the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing catastrophe, the ongoing ethnic cleansing of our people, the ongoing theft of our land. And that signaled thousands of Palestinians to become refugees, forcibly removed from their homes. Homes were burned. The olive tree is actually so significant to us, and the olive trees were burned everywhere. There was just destruction of communities, and people had to flee. And so, just to contextualize it, even with a personal experience, both sides of my family, my grandparents on both sides, were forcibly removed from their homes. My grandmother's home in Jenin was turned into a police station, and my great uncle, who used to run inside of his home as a young kid, was jailed in the same place that he slept peacefully as a young child. So the traumatization that we have experienced in our roots is real. And so that's kind of how things are going. So Palestinians either left indigenous Palestine and they went to neighboring countries to seek refuge because they were literally kicked out of their homes. Like, I want you to imagine someone coming to your home and literally kicking you out and saying, this is my home now. That's exactly what happened. And there's what is happening now to Palestinians living in the occupied territories. And so my family kind of everyone became refugees, like my grandparents did. Where my parents were born, they were born in the countries that my grandparents fled to because they had no other choice. And so that's kind of orienting us on where we are. And I'll pause there to see if anyone else has anything to add.
No, Hannah, I'm pronouncing it right. Is it Hannah
Yeah.
or Hannah?
Yeah,
Hannah?
yeah.
Okay, very good. I think like, and Malak, you guys did such a wonderful job. But I do want to reiterate the point that this is not a religious conflict. The United States loves to portray this as like, oh, these evil Muslims are anti-Semitic and want to take and are just inherently violent. They're like taught from an early age to hate the Jews, and that is like so far from the truth. It's like any other like conflict that's originated in the 1900s. It's colonialism. It's like Europeans coming to a brown country and saying, this is mine now, leave. And like Hannah was saying, my family is from East Jerusalem, and my mom's side, like my grandmother she didn't take during 1948, during the Nakba. They're not too far away from Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin is a notorious village where like a terrorist Zionist group came into Deir Yassin, killed most of the men, burnt down the houses, and like paraded their dead bodies to other neighboring villages so that they can flee. So my grandmother from my mom's side, they fled, and they're like, we're going to come back. They just took like a diaper, like they didn't have diapers back then, but it was like cloth diapers and just like the bare essentials. She didn't even take her jewelry. They just took the house keys and like whatever money they could take. And they had 4 kids back then, and all of them were under 5 and fled to Jordan. They never went back. Both my grandmother and grandfather died in Jordan, not by choice. They wanted to go back. So it's purely just like land theft. There isn't any like religious or anti-Semitic implications to why Palestinians want their land back. It's because it's our home.
Yes, I love that you said that. Like there's no like agenda for why we want to live where we're from in those land that's ours. Like it's a very simple concept that is made to seem complicated so that people aren't vocal about it. And I would liken it to what happened. I would liken it to South African apartheid, where when we look back, even the most whitewashed versions of history will show you that there was a right and a wrong in that situation, that there were people who were experiencing the apartheid policies in the South African government that was implementing those policies against the indigenous people. A similar situation is happening to the Palestinians on an aggravated scale because it's been happening for so long. And the international community has remained silent against the injustices of the Palestinians. The inaction of the international community is what is allowing this occupation to persist. And that's why, even though it's exhausting as Palestinians to constantly show up in spaces and like do this education, we know we have to do it because of the targeted effort. Because the targeted effort that keeps people ignorant and not knowing about anything and then just kind of staying on the sidelines, I really don't fault everyone for that because it's like by design that this is happening. So I think that's why I show up to these spaces to talk about this, and I commend these 2 amazing women who are also doing it, because it's taxing on us to like relive the trauma of telling my family's story, but we do it because we know how important it is for people to understand not only these stories, but to understand the issues at large so that they can then go empower themselves and their communities and talk about the issues with confidence. I mean, that's really what I want walking out of this. Like, I want people to be like, yeah, this is very clear cut and simple. And there are so many Jewish Americans and Jews worldwide who are standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people because they know that this occupation of illegal settler colonialism has nothing to do with Judaism and everything to do with colonial violence, has everything to do with the manipulation of indigenous people and with power. So all these anti-Semitism tropes, I don't want to hear it. I really don't want to hear it because Arabs are Semites. So am I anti myself? I don't think I am. So these what I appreciate now is that like the arguments, which I think we might get into, the arguments are like, they look like super vapid now. It's like it doesn't hold up because the declaration of my freedom and the freedom of my people is not taking away from the existence of Jewish individuals. And there's a difference between Judaism and Jews and Zionism, because you can definitely be Jewish without being a Zionist. And you can definitely be Jewish without calling for the occupation of the Palestinian people.
Oh man, okay, thank you so much. That was from one question alone. We have unearthed so many things. So Madak, thanks for starting us off with the historical overview and definitions. I think it's always really, really important to at least provide like a baseline for everyone, you know, like a same page. And Hannah, thank you also for your personal connection and your story with your grandparents. I thought that was like a really shocking. It really shows like it's intergenerational violence and just connected ongoing trauma that genuinely never ends. Like that's very appalling, and within one household, within one family too. But yeah, and so, and the reminders that this is purposely made to look complicated is also very helpful, because I think some of us get lost sometimes because we're often told such ridiculous counter arguments. Like the anti-Semite thing comes up immediately, so fast. Everyone is ready to pull that card. But yeah, as you all pointed out, it doesn't hold. It doesn't really quite make sense if you really break it down.
And it's good to poke it. It's good to poke at that argument. Like about like what am I saying is anti-Semitic? Because I'm not saying that Jews don't have a right to exist freely. I'm saying that my people deserve freedom too. And they deserve not to have their homes stolen. They deserve not to be jailed. They deserve not to go through checkpoints daily. They deserve not to be harassed by soldiers. They deserve the freedom of travel, the freedom of clean water. They're just as deserving, and we're demanding, and we're not really asking, we're demanding that our land is restored back to us, that we have the right to return, but also that the theft stops and that we can just exist freely on our land.
Right. It's like Lena said really succinctly, it's purely your home. Like there's no other hidden agenda or anything behind it. Like it's land that was taken from you. So it makes sense to be able to want to fight for it as much as you should be. And you mentioned something that kind of leads into our next question. So a lot of us are more or less aware that Palestinians are being forcibly removed from their houses. Like that, for one, has been shown on at least some sources of public media recently. But I think what some of us are less aware of are some of the things, Hannah, you just mentioned, like access to clean water. I also saw mail is also very, very limited, things of that sort. What else is happening, like present day, to Palestinians that we might be less aware of, like the day-to-day struggles and limitations and just lack of basic rights that is happening because of the strict control?
Well, let's talk about like what's going on like recently with the controversial citizenship law that was implemented in 2003 as an emergency measure. I think after the first intifada. First intifada.
I think so.
Yes, first intifada. Yeah. After the first intifada. And so the citizenship law states that Israeli citizens, and that includes Palestinians living in Israel who has Israeli citizenship, they cannot marry someone from the West Bank or they can marry someone from Gaza and the West Bank, but they are not allowed to come to Israel. But someone who is Israel and Jewish can marry anyone they want from any other country, and they're immediately given citizenship and are allowed to live in Israel. And that is meant to target the 2 million Palestinians who live in Israel, so that there can continue to be like family separation to discourage Palestinians from marrying Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza, so that because of a demographic threat. And what is a demographic threat? For Israel, they want like a Jewish majority. I mean, 2018, the Knesset implemented this law saying, or not law, but I guess a statement saying that Israel is a nation state for Jewish Israelis. And it's like saying in the United States that the Congress stating that the United States is a nation for white Americans or Christian Americans. So, and so they failed to renew the law this year, but it wasn't because like they grew a conscience like that's racist. We should allow Palestinians that live in Israel to marry whoever they want. No, it's because it was political reasons, and the new prime minister is like vowing to like add more to it so that could be more racist, so that could be passed. So that's like one thing. Is like like if I lived in like Jerusalem, which is part of like let's say West Jerusalem, I couldn't marry someone I wanted to living in the West Bank. I married my husband living in Chicago. It's like saying, oh, like yeah, you guys can get married, but he can't move to Seattle.
That's a
That's
good
that's
point.
what, yeah, that's one way they do it.
I think another thing that's important to like, I guess like fully like understand. So everything that Israeli government does is so intentional, and like they know exactly what they're doing because they know what results they're trying to get. So like Hannah said earlier, like it is Palestinian land, like it is occupied Palestinian land, but the Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens. Like there are separate roads in Palestine and Israel. Like there are specific license plates that Palestinians have to use because they can't go on certain roads because they're not allowed there. Men and older boys are not able to go pray at Masjid al-Aqsa because they're seen as threats. Only older women and older people and like younger women are able to go pray in those spaces. There are checkpoints to get into different cities. It's so much easier to travel if you have an American citizenship. If you have a Hawiya or like a Palestinian citizenship, you can't go into certain places because you're just simply not allowed there. And there's no debate. You can't argue with anything. You just have to listen because over there the rules don't exist. They can do whatever. The Israeli Defense Force, like they can do whatever they want because they can. The apartheid wall was strategically created and put to separate villages, to ruin farms that were already existing, to separate families. Like everything that is set up now, or the way it's set up, is there for a reason and was created to make life more difficult for Palestinians, and also for Palestinians that want to go back and visit. They make it really difficult at the checkpoints. They try to make your trip as unenjoyable as possible to make sure you don't want to come back, because they don't want you coming back and visiting your land. And when you do come back, you're not able to stay there for more than 3 months. You have a 3-month permit. If you stay longer than that and you leave Palestine, you're not able to ever return. So it's just like a lot of these things people are unaware of, which again, like I don't blame people for being unaware of because it is the way the media is set up and created, but it's so important to recognize how much more difficult life is for Palestinians just because of their identity.
Yeah, that was really good context, I think. Really, the day-to-day, imagine going through your day-to-day life and doing simple actions like driving to and from work, which should take 10 minutes, will take you like an hour and a half because you're going through checkpoints. When we say checkpoints, I'm talking about places where there are soldiers with guns harassing you, asking you questions, making your day miserable intentionally so that you give up. And that's essentially what I think all oppressive forces want. They want people to get tired and give up. And so that's why it's so important for us to keep sustaining our efforts, our activism efforts, because that is what's going to help us long term, is us not giving up and running on E. So I'll add to this by saying there's 3 primary groups of Palestinians that we're talking about. And I want to make sure that the audience understands what these 3 groups are. So Palestinians refer to what is considered internationally as Israel as 48 land. So when we say Israel, we're talking about people who are living under what is not considered occupied Palestine internationally. It is considered Israel internationally, but Palestinians call it 48 land. If you look at a map of Palestine, like imagine this is the strip of land. So there is a group here that is the occupied West Bank, and there's a group that's the Gaza Strip, and then the rest of it is what is internationally considered as Israel. And so there are Palestinians living as Israeli citizens. You know, they probably like will cringe hearing that, but yeah. So they're living as Israeli citizens, right? But they don't have their full rights. So they can't vote in the same way. They don't have the same representation. And that's done intentionally because the Israeli government wants to maintain a Jewish majority in whatever form of representation exists. So there are different struggles that Palestinians who are Israeli citizens face. That's one group. The next group are Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank. Palestinians, when we talk about the checkpoints, when we talk about like the harassment, when we talk about raids in the middle of the night, like this is a group of people experiencing that. And it's constant, like it's just constant bombardment by occupied forces, constant harassment. There are accounts I've read of children talking to journalists and they're like, I feel helpless. I feel like I have no, and I'm like adding these words because it's like a 12-year-old saying this, but no agency over my own body. Like I can't move the way I want to because it's literal enforcement daily. And again, it's done intentionally. A child will be riding on a bicycle and a soldier will take the bicycle away from them and harass them for it. And they have to walk home without their bicycle. And from a child experiencing that, that's a very, very traumatic experience. And it's constant bombardment like this, like not just one or two people, like this is the norm. It's normal if you're living in the occupied territories to have people in your family or yourself be jailed or know people who are jailed. Like this is the norm. Oh yeah, I was arrested. Oh, years ago. Yeah, recently. Oh yeah, my cousin's still in jail. Like it happens like this, throwing a rock. You look at a soldier a wrong way, they'll find a reason to arrest you. And the conditions in these jails, like the conditions in America are terrible in American jails and prisons. So imagine it in an area where you're intentionally occupying a people, torture tactics. I'm talking no right. I read a story actually recently that during the protests against what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, that this young woman was jailed and she told the officer in the jail, can you please not lower the temperature too much because I get cold very fast and I can get sick. And she described this as like the worst thing that ever came out of my mouth, because once the soldier realized this, or the officer, he turned down the temperature so low so that she was shivering, and she was in her cell for like 14 hours and she was there just shivering. These are the types of tactics that are used against Palestinians. And I really want you to imagine like literally sitting there, and she has like some form of medical condition where she gets colder than the average person in these temperatures as a tactic of the occupied forces, right? Of the occupying forces. So there's that group. And then the last group are those living in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. This is what is deemed as the largest open air prison by numerous human rights groups. There is control over what goes in and what goes out of Gaza. The food, water, everything is rationed for the people. Electricity. There you go. Like electricity. They have internet for certain hours of the day. I was doing a live with someone who, there you go. I was doing a live with someone and we had to strategically do the live during hours where she had internet access, where she had light access. Fishermen are not allowed to fish beyond the zones where all the fish are, to keep the economy down, to make sure that people aren't sustaining themselves. If you want to leave, you have to get approval through the Israeli government. You think they're going to let Palestinians leave? It's like constant bombardment by the occupying forces. So these are the different things that Palestinians are experiencing. And those are the three main groups that we're talking about.
Ooh, I did want to add one more thing, especially now with like the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, I think there was something that's talked about how Israel was one of the like leading countries with like the vaccine, and they had so much of the vaccine, but they made sure to at first only give it to their Israeli population. And even though they had like an ample amount of it, they made sure to not give it to the Palestinians living in Palestine, occupied Palestine as well.
Which they have a duty to do under international law. Those who are occupying people have a duty to, Israel doesn't do this, but they have a duty to maintain the health of the people who are being occupied, and this is not happening.
Israel
No,
has like broken like over 70 international laws.
but not only that, there was also recently news, I think about a month ago, where Israel was going to donate COVID vaccines to, was it the West Bank or Gaza?
I'm not sure which one.
I think it was the West Bank. But it turns out these vaccines were going to expire in 2 weeks, and Israel wasn't donating these vaccines. It was an agreement between the Palestinian Authority, which is the government of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where they in turn would give them vaccines later when they were able to get the vaccine. So it was an exchange. They declined the vaccines because they were going to expire in 2 weeks, and there was no way they were going to be able to administer those vaccines in such short notice. And that was played in news as the Palestinian Authority rejecting a donation from Israel. So that's kind of a way that, speaking just of COVID-19, of how the media manipulates what's going on the ground to always portray Palestinians as like an aggressor, and always denying peace just because we're inherently violent and unpeaceful people.
Cool. Awesome. I have learned so much in the span of like 7 minutes. Okay. So just to wrap up that question, the summary of the citizenship law, that was really telling. Just the fact that like we hear often that they're treated as second-class citizens, and or those like Palestinians living in Israel are, and then also the everyday day-to-day just like literal roadblocks. And I think something that really stood out to me is just the constant strategy for mental fatigue. Like even from a young age, they're just taught to give up, taught not to fight, or like, I mean, you can imagine only so much you can possibly want to fight for. So I think that's even more telling of like the constant strength that it takes to be able to speak up and to like continuously just fight for your own freedom and your own land. And then also, Hannah, thank you very much for, sorry, go on.
No, you're good. I want to add one thing. Palestinians, we're not taught not to fight. We're actually, like, Palestinian children are the most inspiring ones to me, because they literally will go up to a soldier twice their size and like be all up in their face. And I'm like, this is like, I can't contain how like proud I am seeing them just be fearless in the face of the occupier. But I think Palestinians I think that the occupier tries to teach us, right, or tries to teach Palestinians to hush, but Palestinians will never hush. And like, that's also in our nature, to be fighters and to stand up for our land and for our roots.
That's a better way of putting it. Yeah. Thank you for that. The less of like not trying to fight, but more, I guess, the constant tactics of the occupiers to, in every single direction, just try to fatigue you in every sort of way. Like with the prison, for example, that was terrible. Like literally anything that could potentially bring someone down, though, it seems like they'll try to employ. But yeah. Oh, and the breakdown of the 3 specific groups and locations I thought was also very, very helpful, and good clarification for those of us who might be unaware. All right, so our next prepared discussion question is in terms of what we can do from abroad, basically. So I think probably several of us in the audience likely attended the May protests and have done our best to constantly raise awareness, but it can still feel easy to like feel helpless or feel like we aren't quite doing enough. What are the best ways that you would suggest we can do our part to help the situation despite being so far away?
Local politics. For example, in Ohio, Nina Turner is running for I forgot what position, but she's running, and she's advocated for Palestinian rights, has been critical of the Israeli oppression of Palestinians, and there's like, so like, you know, Hillary Clinton endorsed her opponent. There's like so many ads running against her, claiming that she's anti-Semitic. If you're in a county or state or whatever, and there is a person running who is pro-Palestinian, vote for them. Local politics, it's so important. I think, like, it's so wonderful seeing people participating in protests and being engaged in social media and sharing posts and stories from Palestinian voices. But local politics is also really important. Oh, and BDS.
Yeah, BDS.
If someone wants to talk about BDS.
Yeah, I was also going to touch on, so first, educating folks. So many people are unaware or uneducated on the occupation in Palestine. And, it is unfortunate that Palestinians do have to pay a price when we speak up about the injustices done to our people and to our land. So it's really important for our allies to also step up and play a part, because Zionists do what they can to scare Palestinians from advocating for Palestinian liberation. So whether it be sharing posts on social media or having those conversations with people that are misinformed, these are ways that can help Palestinians, and just changing the stigma around talking about Palestine, making it less of a, uncontroversial topic. Also, shifting the narrative that the Western media has created is definitely a first step, because the Palestinian issue, like Hannah and Lena said before, is not a religious issue. It's a humanitarian one. Everyone has a part to play in Palestinian liberation. And then, like what Lena was mentioning before, boycotting BDS. So BDS partakes in boycotting Israeli products that are produced in the West Bank. So by boycotting these products, the movement and its followers are boycotting the exploitation of illegally occupied Palestinian land. So these products harm the economy of all working class Palestinians, because it takes away from their resources and exploits them for cheap labor. So BDS is a first step in condemning the illegal practices of Israel, and takes a rights-based approach in doing so.
Yeah, that's Lena killing it. Lena killing it.
I'm loving the discussion. I'm also just like
it's also really nice to talk about it with other Palestinians, right? Like, Zahra, we love you. But the exchange, I'm like, yeah, someone gets it. You know what I mean? Because sometimes it feels like you're talking in an empty room because of all the educating we have to do. So this is Hamza, really refreshing. In adding on to this point about Palestinians paying a price, this is real. My whole life, from my personal experience, my family members and different advisors would tell me, be careful who you tell that you're Palestinian. Be careful. From a young age, as young as elementary school, I was told this. And I remember always being proud to be Palestinian. It wasn't about pride in my identity. I've never met a Palestinian who's not proud to be Palestinian, and I will never meet one, because we are tremendously proud of who we are and where we come from. At the same time, there's a price to be paid when you are targeted for your identity in this country. And so it took a long time for me personally to even feel comfortable declaring that I'm Palestinian when I walk into a room, because the implications of that declaration could be drastic on my career and my future. I remember growing up being like, y'all are a bit paranoid. I think people can know I'm Palestinian. But I'm gonna give you a real life example about how this targeting is real. My whole life, as I mentioned, people who are close to me obviously knew I was Palestinian. I would wear my Palestinian thobes, all this stuff, but I wasn't vocal about the injustice. That is something I kept to myself, particularly in professional spaces. And so even in my college years, I wasn't a part of SJP. I was always rooting for SJP on the side, but I didn't become a part of the org because I knew that particularly where I went to college, there was a huge Zionist presence. I knew that those people were being profiled. So I was like, all right, I'm going to try to protect myself here and not get profiled. My thought process was always, eventually at a point in my life, I'm going to have the acumen to be able to talk about this with certain protections, right? Look at how much we have to go through to even talk about being Palestinian. Crazy. So the one time I spoke openly about being Palestinian in a public forum was in college, like in my second to last year of college. And the SJP folks came up to me and they're like, we're doing a BDS bill. You just heard about BDS through MENAC, right? We're doing this BDS bill and we need Palestinians and we need people to come talk about their experience to push for this bill so that our university can divest from our contracts with the state of Israel. And so I'm like, okay, this is one thing. This is like my whole career. I have not been involved with anything on paper relating to Palestine. But the one time I did, I was like, yeah, this is a public forum. There's like 50 students for the Palestinians and like 50 students for the, Israeli side. I'm like, okay, there's enough people where it's like not a big deal. I'm gonna go talk. I went up, I talked about how the Palestinians are living in the largest open air prison, and I talked about my family's story. I only said my first name. A few weeks after this, I, along with a bunch of other Palestinians and other student activists, mainly Muslim students who spoke, there were non-Muslim students who spoke, but mainly the Muslim ones were the ones profiled, were placed on a blacklist called Canary Mission. This blacklist intends to smear people who dare to speak up against the occupation. It links you with anti-Semitism, and they pull all your social media profiles and they create this profile for you, and it's all compiled in one place. And they also try to figure out what other groups you're involved in. For example, if you're a Muslim and you're involved with the Muslim Students Association, they'll have a description of what the MSA is, but they link it with terrorism. So they're like, oh, the founder is like this XYZ terrorist. And like, obviously this is a terrorist group. So this person they're trying to like implicate that we are involved with all these activities, right? You can go hear what I talked about in my speech. I would say it now, and I will say it on when I died. I ain't say nothing controversial. I just spoke truth to power. But this is what happens when Palestinians raise their voices. And I'm not the first, and I won't be the last who has been profiled this way. And particularly Palestinians are the ones who pay the price. Because Manak mentioned this earlier, the profile that I have on Canary, now if I wanted to go back to Palestine and I wanted to visit my family living in Palestine, they're going to see my Canary profile. I don't know how many hours of questioning I'm going to encounter. I don't know if they're going to deny me entry to see my family because I now have a Canary Mission profile. And this is the organization that runs this is based in the US, but they report, actually, sorry, I think part based in the US, part in Israel. But the point is that the information is connected. And I also want to say, I only said my first name. Based on my first name, these people could just figure out who I was. They cross-referenced on my socials. It's on this profile. This is probably one of the first few links that comes up if you Google my name. I don't recommend that people click on this link, by the way, because if you click on it, you're giving more like publicity to the site, and we want to prevent that. Like activists have tried to prevent people from divesting traffic to the site. But this is what happens when Palestinians speak up. Like we're actually risking a lot being vocal and having our identities tied to what we're saying, because there's implications not only for us, but for our families who live in the occupied territories. So this is a very real risk. So the importance of allyship, I can't stress it enough, because the risk for us is like, I think about it daily. But it got to a point like after Canary and recently with what we're seeing happening in Palestine, particularly with the forced displacements in Sheikh Jarrah, I told myself, enough is enough. I'm doing what the occupier wants. And I don't expect every Palestinian to have this realization, because it's very difficult to come by. And I think people struggle with this daily. Like even Palestinian advocacy groups have to make sure there aren't spies infiltrating the groups, because there's such a targeted effort to quiet us, because it's such a simple concept. Because if you see the truth, you understand that there should be freedom for the Palestinian people. But the systemic efforts is to make it look complicated. So that's why they're scared when we talk. That's why they're scared of BDS. They're scared of BDS because BDS works. It hits them in their pockets. So if you want to do something today, educate yourself about the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. Educate yourself on where your money is going. Don't pay for products that fund the occupation of the Palestinian people. A few companies are Puma, the cat company that does the bulldozing in Palestine, the construction companies, I mean. There's say it again. HP. There's a list of them on the BDS website. There you go. Tons of of research out there on this. And what helped stop South African apartheid? It was sanctions. It was sanctions. It was pressure from the international community. The Israeli government is not going to suddenly grow a conscience and stop occupying the Palestinians. It's on us, particularly us in the US, particularly us not living under the occupying conditions. We're the ones who have the power to vote locally, ensure that those who are in our offices are working for us. Baby, vote them out. They don't need to be there if they're not working for you. Vote them out. That's one thing. Figure out who your representatives are. Engage in BDS. Please engage in BDS. Figure out where your money is going. Hurt them in their pockets. That's how you stop this occupation. You want to hurt them in their pockets, and you want to never stop quieting your voice on this, particularly if you're not Palestinian. Because I can understand if a Palestinian won't, for safety of themselves and their family. But particularly if you're not, we really need you in this movement. Always follow Palestinian voices, but when you have an opportunity to educate and advocate, do it. The last thing I'll say is, I think in advocacy generally, people get overwhelmed because maybe they'll go to talks like this and they're like, I don't know what to do. Like, I see all of this stuff, but I'm overwhelmed. Like, I don't know how to help in my little life, right? Everyone can do something. One thing a week, one thing a day. Everyone has the power to do something. Pick one organization fighting for Palestinian rights. There are people who have dedicated their whole entire lives to this cause. Pick one organization whose mission and values you align with and follow their initiatives. Go to their panel, go to the webinar, sign the petition, and whenever they have a call to action, follow through. If you do this and you sustain it over a long period of time, that is how real change will be made. And another thing is, more recently, we're seeing what's happening in Silwan. There's a link that's bit.ly/save Silwan call. And what it does is it links you to call your representatives and demand that they hold the Israeli government accountable for the forced displacements and the destruction of the homes in Silwan. It all happens through our elected officials. It all happens through these people because they're sitting on the lobby money. They're sitting on the Zionist lobby in AIPAC. They're funding their re-election campaign. So of course they're going to be loyal to Israel, but you need to tell them that that's not going to fly. That's not going to fly with me. I'm a constituent and I have my voice. And I want them to know you by name. I want you to call their offices so often that the aide knows your name, that when they pick up, they're like, is this Zahra? Yeah, it's Zahra. I'm here talking because the Palestinian people deserve their freedom. And why is it so important as Americans? Because it's our tax dollars that are being used to fund this illegal military occupation. $10 million a day we give as a gift just here to the state of Israel, when that money can be better spent, invested in our communities so that we don't have thousands of people who are homeless in this country, so that we rebuild our infrastructure and our education systems. We deserve as Americans for that money to be spent to invest in our communities, not to fund an illegal occupation and continue an ongoing injustice that should have ended and should have actually never even happened years ago. All right, I was preaching a bit, but I had to let them know.
I had to stay muted, so I wasn't like,
I know, I was
keep
like,
going, yes.
This is so good. Okay. Did you guys have anything else to add? Okay, awesome. Wow, thank you, Hannah. Well, I'm taking my moderator notes, but I'm also like, there's just some things that should not be repeated. Like, it's just so well said the first time that it's useless to try to wrap it up. Okay. I'm gonna skip the next question that I prepared for you guys because we've discussed BDS. But okay, so this is going to be the closing question, unless there are other things that our panelists would like to add. So in closing, there seems to be a recent turn in public reception recently. Like, more and more people are rejecting the typical media narrative that is fed to them and doing their own research. Also, the protests in May led to historic numbers. I remember growing up, the first ever protest my family went to was my dad took all of us to a protest for Palestine when we were in like elementary school. And I just remember like 30 or 40 people would show up, and that would be a big deal. That would be like, wow, so many people are showing support. But this past May, like thousands of people in Chicago alone. It was crazy to see. Of course, there's more work to be done, but does this potentially present like hope for change? Like, what does this mean to you all, and how can we continue this upward trend? And I think Malak put it really well as well. Shifting the narrative and changing the stigma around how people talk about Palestine. How can we continue to do that in the best way possible?
I think social media has allowed us to see what's happening on the grounds. Like, it is really hard to watch a video of someone's home being bulldozed, people crying because their home is being bulldozed, and be like, I want to hear the other side of the story. So I think that's like definitely why the narrative is shifting, is because people are not being fed something that's like so sanitized. You know, almost every single news article about like the bombings happening in Gaza is like Israel responding to Hamas aggression. 122 dead. Who are the dead? The people of Gaza. 66 children. Like you have like the people's like pictures of them being happy. You have like their names, you have their voices, you have like images of what's happening. And it's hard to stay silent. It's hard when you see what's going on to be like, no, I still need the entire picture. I think that's why the narrative is shifting, is people are seeing the injustice. I can't imagine what Palestine would look like if we had iPhones in 1948, if we had iPhones in 1967, in 2001. And I think the situation would have looked so different, because this isn't just like collective punishment and people's homes being demolished. It's not something new. It's something it's how Israel was created, but now we're seeing it with our own eyes. And I think that's why so many people are in the streets demanding justice, because like you can't see that and not be nauseous. You can't see that and not be shaking from anger, unless you don't have a heart.
Yeah, I definitely agree that I feel, especially within the last month or that 1 week where there was so much social media coverage on what was happening in Palestine, and just like the hashtag with like Save Sheikh Jarrah and all of that. And then I saw celebrities tweeting about Palestine, and I was like, I never thought I would see the day where celebrities were talking about what's going on in Palestine. And just that alone, even though I knew it wasn't much, it was just like a simple tweet. I was like, this does present hope for change, because, you know, 10 years ago, I would have never, ever in my life, like, imagined Palestine to receive this type of coverage or even see this slight shift in the narrative.
Yeah.
So sorry.
Go ahead, Dina.
I'm so sorry. I just want to add that the narrative is changing because of Palestinians living on the ground. Palestinians who are sacrificing their lives. So many have been jailed and in administrative detention, not allowed to see their families because of these videos, because they're risking their lives to speak the truth. And I just, seeing that like always like overwhelms me and makes me like tear up. It's like they're so brave and so courageous, and I think that's why we owe it to them to follow them, seek out like their voices, because there's every single tweet, every single video is a sacrifice, not only for themselves but their families and their loved ones.
And to add to that, and like this kind of also goes back to that first question that you asked us about like what keeps us going, or what for like when it comes to this type of work, is like I feel like this is really the least I can do. Like as a Palestinian, a second generation Palestinian in America, like most of my family lives here too. This is how I'm helping my people back home. This is how I'm helping my family, eventually have the ability to return back to our land.
Yeah. And I would add that Palestinians have become the journalists, period, because you're not going to see this coverage on CNN. I grew up my whole life where panels where they talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there wasn't a Palestinian on the panel. And that has just been then the constant narrative for years and years and years. So to see so many people talking about Palestine openly, that sparked hope for me, because I think people shy away so much from talking about this under different excuses. They don't know enough. They don't want to be labeled anti-Semitic. It's not their fight, so they're going to just wait on the side. But I think this period of time where we had this explosion of posts, we also had an explosion of information, and it's like we pulled the lid over it. Like Palestinians, we've known this, right? We live it. We've known this for years and years. But for people who don't know, to see it all at once, I think that really impacted me and made me think we might get to a point where we can really affect real change. And so my thought process is we have to take this momentum and we need to sustain it, because right now I think the postings have died down. And I think people might be tuned in, but not to the same level they might have been a couple weeks ago. But what happened a couple weeks ago is why we got this panel right now. Like, that's why we have this conversation. So that's why these long-term efforts are what's most important to me as someone who's a Palestinian and a part of the movement for a free Palestine. Is we just have to not get tired. Like, we have to keep talking about it. And it can be exhausting talking about it all the time. So we're not saying every second of every day, but find the time that you can in your personal capacity to maintain your activism for what's happening, because God will be your witness on the day of judgment that you did something for justice, and the Palestinian people need you. As humans, we are, by design, it's within us to want to support one another. And so the occupation has no borders. The same tactics being used on Palestinians are used here at home against Black and Brown communities, against people of color. And the surveillance that is used by the Israeli government on the Palestinian people is implemented against Muslim communities in the US. So it's very much connected. If that's not reason enough, there's enough reason for you to even hear our stories and feel slightly compelled by them and want to do something. So sign the petitions, figure out who your representatives are, and call them. I'm telling you, call them. 10 calls a day in congressional offices on a single issue will call the attention of the representative. Only 10. So imagine if all of us in this room, in this Zoom call, called a congressional representative, Jamie Raskin, for example, and demanded accountability on the issue of the freedom of the Palestinian people. We can affect real change. It's just a matter of us putting in the work. And I hope that today's talk, hearing from us, inspires you to continue that work.
And that's all so wonderful. And again, like, that's just why education is so important. Like, don't let the other side scare you from speaking on Palestine, or try to make you think that you're wrong or you're confused, because you're not. And like, there's a quote from Malcolm X, like, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power because they control the minds of the masses. So just continue to educate yourself, continue to educate others. And, inshallah, one day we'll all be able to see a free Palestine in our lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. That was a really great way to close, I think. Before I formally close, do any of you have any other closing words you'd like to add? Anything that maybe we might have missed and not touched upon?
There are just 2 websites I think everyone should know. One of them is decolonizepalestine.com. This is a good center for information. And the next one is ifamericans.knew.org. This is another one. If you want to just brush up on the connection that the United States has in maintaining this illegal military occupation, these are good sites for you to check out. So I would say continue to speak with Palestinians. I mean, I personally feel so validated in a way. Like, I feel the validation from my family and from like my identity, like knowing that I'm doing what's right, I'm on the right side of history. But seeing people who have like really no connection to Palestine through their own personal lives and come up to me and say that they're wholeheartedly with the Palestinian people, that gives me inspiration, and that breathes, life into me when I'm feeling those low moments when we're just constantly bombarded by the occupying forces. So even talking to Palestinians and just conveying your solidarity with us, it does mean a lot. And so I'll leave it with those 2, inshallah.
I just want to say thank you so much for organizing this and having 3 Palestinian women's voices centered. It's pretty rare, and I really appreciate it. I think those two websites are really wonderful. I would also like follow just like people living in occupied Palestine. Oh my God, I'm blanking on his name, but the twins, Muhammad and Malak. God. Yes, of course. The twins are like always providing videos, always like discussing what's happening, and they're from Sheikh Jarrah. So following these voices are really important to just know exactly what's happening on the ground to get. And then there's another website called Al-Haq, ALHAQ, and that's from that's by a Palestinian lawyer who routinely like posts like laws are discriminatory against Palestinians and either like living in Israel, occupied West Bank or Gaza, and also the demands of the Palestinian people. Yeah, those are, but again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Zahra. This was a wonderful event. If even like one person, which I know everyone might have has taken something away from this event, I'm sure everyone has learned something that just makes it all the more worth it.
Thank you to the three of you for not only agreeing to speak with us, but then also educating us and taking the time to do so, because that's often something I think we take for granted, just like having people teach us very things that we should already know. So thank you for that. And I also think just you guys are too gracious. Like, I genuinely, inviting Palestinians to talk about Palestine is probably the bare minimum that anyone can do.
No, you guys are doing so much. Like, no, this is a huge, like, thank you.
Yeah, it means a lot.
We all like really appreciate it.
Yeah, because they've been ignoring us for years. So finally we got the mic. You know what I'm saying?
No, I was just thinking about it. Like, if you ask a Palestinian to speak about Palestine, we can go on for hours.
Oh yeah, we can. Yeah, we can.
Also, I want to know, all of us have like a Palestine thing. I noticed all of us. I think every Palestinian has like that in their Zoom background. There's like something,
yes,
a map of Palestine or anything Palestine.
Yes.
Yeah. And you can also follow us on our collective socials and activism journeys. I don't know if Zahra has that for everyone.
Yeah, we tag them. We tag you all on our Instagram pages. Lena, I know you're private. I don't know if you would be okay with it. So
I'm quite okay with it, but to be quite honest, I'm an old person. I'm not active on social media.
Okay.
You're not old, Nina.
Thank you.
So
yeah.
If any of our audience wants to find them on our Instagram page, we've tagged all these women on our original post. So yeah, and another thing to our audience, if there's like one thing I want our international youth to take away, it's something that stood out to me is just like the targeted effort to silence and blacklist Palestinian activists and anyone who speaks up, just for simply sharing their stories and their families' stories, just for being Palestinian. I mean, Malak and I, we went to the same school. Like, we know people who have been blacklisted and are constantly like in fear of being put on Canary. So to our international audience, please think about that and think about the importance of allyship and how much your voice can carry if you choose to do so. If that's the one thing, like, I would really appreciate you all take away from this. Although there's so much information that we just learned from today that is going to be very useful as we try to educate the people around us. So thank you all again. Thank you, Hannah, Malak, and Lena, for your time and energy. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed not playing an active role today. Like, I really like just watching you all bounce off of each other. It was really refreshing. Thank you very much. Okay, so before I formally close, I have one note. This is a change in direction. Indonesia is currently struggling with the most severe COVID outbreak the country has ever seen, and the IMSA community is currently mourning the deaths of several family and friends as the entire country continues to struggle with the lack of medical resources. So please consider donating to IMSA Care. The money will go towards oxygen tanks, funeral coffins, meals, and more to provide for the country. Also,
is there
IMSA
a
Youth
link?
is returning. Yes, yeah, I can provide a link.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay. All right, and then to our audience, thank you once again for choosing to take the time out of your Thursday night to learn about Palestine and learn about the day-to-day struggles that are currently happening, but then also learn about what we can do to move towards a free Palestine, inshallah. Thank you once again. May we see a free Palestine in our lifetimes, and may we constantly work towards a free Palestine. Until then, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you to our panelists. This was a great informative panel. I feel very